Promeia, Krampus' secret weapon and a cold, Notorious judge, has come around as a playable S-rank ice anomaly agent. She's got big shoes to fill given the last character we had of the sort. But while Miyabi is dependent on the Zorta dancing for her mechanics, Promeia goes all in on the constant application of shadows instead, having obscenely high anomaly build-up values on her skills and getting much of her damage from Ablooms. And not only are her numbers very good, this makes her uniquely suited to work with future wind anomaly agents. After all,
during this state, inflicting other anomalies won't trigger disorder. Instead, it'll trigger vortex.
Between her competitive burst damage, on-demand counters, and even the ability to buff an entire team's Ablooms, Promeia has turned out to be a strong unit that's more than capable of holding her own. So let's go through her kit and touch on how it's integrated with anomaly mechanics, via the unique Abloom Scaling method or the importance of finishes in her routing, and then go through her builds, Mindscapes, and team options. After which, we'll cover her combos and how she plays, then close with some high-scoring deadly assault runs. Once we're done, hopefully you see that Promeia makes for a worthy entry into what's arguably the most anti-shield element rogue combination in the game to date. As a very short intro to how Promeia works, you notice a gauge underneath her portrait in combat. Building this gauge through attacks will convert it into points, which can then be spent on a unique EX special that triggers an Abloom. Although she needs points to use it, the skill is also locked behind certain moves, so figuring out how to optimize her resource build, then how to effectively transition into her unique EX special is part of what makes her gameplay engaging. All of which begins with her cool passive, Thief of Flames. For every point of Promeia's initial anomaly mastery over 150, she gets a 1.5 personal increase to her anomaly proficiency and a team-wide 0.35% increase to Abloom damage. Note that this increase to Abloom damage sits on a separate multiplier than standard damage percent bonuses, making it especially potent. Stats aside, it's here that her unique resource and its behavior are defined. Corrosive Chill is the name of the gauge. It has a cap of 100 and most of her attacks will build it, with varying values for each move. Here's a table that showcases how much a given attack will build, and some moves are notably a fair bit better than others. On top of generating it via attack, she also gets a bonus on certain statuses. When Freeze, Disorder, or Vortex are triggered by any squad member, Promeia included, she gets an extra 5 Corrosive Chill. When using her Shrouded and Shadow EX special, she gets an extra 10. And when squad members other than Promeia trigger Ablooms, then she gets an extra 15. Corrosive Chill has an auto-conversion property to it. When 50 of it is built, it is automatically consumed to generate a trial by code point, having a cap of 2 and being tracked by the beads next to her gauge. If already capped out, then the gauge can build past 50, but when a point is used up, the excess Corrosive Chill will be instantly converted into a trial by code point. 2 points are also generated on entering the battlefield, but Mindscapes aside, filling up the Corrosive Chill gauge is the only way to get them in combat. These trial by code points form the backbone of Promeia's damage, and it's only when they're stocked that she can use her Merciless Judgment EX special, which itself consumes a point on cast. When it hits an enemy under any attribute anomaly, it will trigger an Abloom. This is not only great for damage, but for resource management too. Although it's only on other characters as Ablooms that Promeia gets Corrosive Chill buildup, her own Ablooms give her a flat 100 decibel bonus when triggered, with a 0.5 second cooldown. Promeia has multiple ways of triggering Ablooms outside of her Merciless Judgment EX special, namely her Chain Attack and Ultimate, with their own distinct multipliers. Ablooms from Trial by Code, however, scale with the level of her cool passive, dealing up to 635% attribute anomaly damage of the corresponding attribute. This wording is ever so slightly different from previous iterations of Ablooms, which deal an additional instance of attribute anomaly damage equal to a percentage of the original attribute anomaly damage. It's all quite word salady, but such distinctions matter. The observant among you may have noticed that previous Ablooms had varying values based on the active attribute. For agents like Vivian and Arya, these Ablooms scaled with their anomaly proficiency and mastery respectively, whereas for Nangong, it was a fixed value, but fundamentally they all work the same, having distinct numbers for each anomaly. As an example, at 250 anomaly mastery, Arya's scaling for ice anomalies is 90%. What this means is that if a shadow triggered for 10,000 damage, then her Abloom would hit for 9,000, 90% of the original attribute anomaly damage. It doesn't matter how much attack percent or damage bonus she has at the time of the Abloom triggering, it's always a proportion of the currently active anomaly's individual instance of damage. Different scaling values mattered because different anomalies have different multipliers. Burn, for example, hits far more often than Shatter, but as a result, each tick of Burn is balanced to be a lot weaker. So instead of the 90% scaling that Arya has for Ice with 250 anomaly mastery, it has almost 900% scaling instead. Burn that ticks for just over 1000 leads to an Abloom that deals 9000 damage. Promeia though has a fixed multiplier for all of them, 635%. If you were to go by the previous behavior, this would make her Ablooms pathetically weak on fire and corruption and absurdly strong on ice and physical. 635% of 10,000 would be 63,500, but then you try to practice and it's a lot lower. On the other hand, a corruption hitting for 1000 should yield 6,350 damage, but it turns out to be a lot higher. Just over 10 times higher in fact. The reason behind this is that Promeia scaling is not a proportion of the original anomaly damage, but a direct modification to anomaly multipliers. I won't go into too much detail on the formula, you can check out the document linked in the description for that, but in short, each anomaly tick of damage has a unique multiplier value. For Shatter, it's 500%. For Corruption, it's 62.5%. Promea's Ablooms function as an override to that multiplier. She's only hitting slightly harder than a Shatter on Ice Ablooms because a 635% multiplier is only 1.27 times higher than 500%. Likewise, her Ether Ablooms are more than 10 times higher because 635% is more than 10 times higher than 62.5%, the original damage multiplier of Corruption. In practice, the end result is no different than before. Both the old Ablooms and those from Promeia function as a snapshot of the current anomaly stats. No matter how strong Promeia is, if the Abloom is being triggered off an anomaly from an unbuffed, ungeared character, it won't do any damage. The same is true in reverse. With the stronger the original anomaly, the harder Ablooms hit. The only difference then is that whereas before it was possible for some elements to scale better or worse than others depending on an individual character's Abloom multipliers, Promea's Ablooms are truly equal for all. Triggering them on an ice anomaly will often lead to the highest damage, not because ice scales particularly well. All anomalies are fixed to that 635% multiplier after all, but because Promeia is most likely to have the highest stats on a team when building up anomaly, so having a Abloom scale with that tends to be the best thing to snapshot from. All this is to say, her Abloom multipliers are pretty good. Even without the Abloom damage percent bonuses from her core passive, each Abloom is going to be stronger than a Shatter, and almost as strong as an Assault. With the bonuses, and it's far higher, especially because Abloom damage isn't the only thing that she buffs. As part of her additional ability, activated if there are anomaly or support characters in a team, Promeia will inflict Presumption of Guilt on targets hit by any of her react specials for 30 seconds. This applies a 40% death shred to all Ablooms hitting set target, meaning not only Promeia's, but those of other characters too. In a way, this makes Promeia be somewhat akin to Jane, at first a main damage dealer, but at the same time having the potential to work as a pseudo-support to other units, given that both Abloom damage and death shred bonuses are universal. On top of that, Promeia gets a 30% boost to her Ice Anomaly build-up rate for 30 seconds after using EX specials, as well as an unconditional 3-second increase to Frostbite by all squad members. Note here that Frostbite is effectively a way of saying Ice Anomaly. Like Rina and Bernice before her, instead of the usual 10 seconds that anomalies last for, Promeia extends it to 13 seconds. I make this clear so as to clarify that it's not just the crit damage effect that's extended, but the anomaly as a whole. Enemies that can be frozen won't stay encased any longer than usual, but you do have more time with which to get a disorder or trigger Ablooms. With her passives now out of the way, we can talk about her attacks, starting with basics. Promeia has two sets of them, a regular and a health string. The regular is Sweeping Edge, accessed by tapping on the basic attack button. She'll deliver a series of attacks and build up her corrosive chill gauge while doing so. Basics 1 through to 3 aren't all that noteworthy, but basic 4 is. That's because when used, Promeia will enter the bound absolution state. She'll throw off her cloak and have it continuously deal damage to enemies, allowing her to aura farm with a unique slow walk animation. The lingering cloak also has a ridiculously large hitbox and vacuum effect, making it useful to gather up enemies and shield defense. If she happens to be attacked during this state, she'll automatically perfect dodge once, with a 20-second cooldown, but there's nothing stopping you from manually dodging. In fact, doing so is needed if you want to assist counter, which is quite important for Promeia's corrosive chill gauge generation. But do note that dodging during this bound absolution state will end it. In all honesty, the state itself isn't particularly strong. None of its attacks build anything. Daze, energy, decibels, anomaly, corrosive chill gauge, you name it, and it has one of the lowest damage multipliers in the entire game. Its primary purpose isn't what comes after it, Promeia's Basic 5, one of the few skills that links into her Merciless Judgment EX special. Let's call it the Abloom EX going forwards. Her full basic attack string is quite slow though, very slow in fact, taking around 4.5 seconds to complete in full. This is where Promeia's Whirling Blade comes in, her held basic attack. When used, she'll deliver a few strikes and immediately go into the bound absolution state, which results in a much faster turnaround to basic 5 and the Abloom EX. Which basic to use though is situational. That's because this whole basic attack doesn't build any corrosive chill gauge, and that's on top of having lower multipliers than that of Promeia's full basic string, which has much of its value evenly spread across attacks. So spamming it results in lower damage overall, both from it taking longer to generate trial by code points and from its poor anomaly buildup, even if it does yield more basic 5s. The point of this is that it gives an accessible way to get to basic 5 quickly, and in turn, link into the Abloom EX. The bulk of her damage comes from it, and the only other way to use it is through Promeia's specials, of which she has many, 3 specials and 3 EX specials in total. The first special is Cold Flash, let's call it her regular special, and it's used when pressing the special button when under 40 energy. Here the developers continue the trend of incredibly cool looking animations that we'll never see use. It has terrible multipliers and isn't even all that fast, so it serves no real purpose. The regular EX special, however, is useful, being Glacial Death. It costs 40 energy and will have Promeia throw her cloak and enter the bound absolution state. The attack itself isn't actually any good, it builds only 2.8 corrosive chill gauge, barely any more than Promea's basic 2, and far less than her basics 3, 4, or 5. Its decibel and anomaly build-up rate are awful, being almost on par with her regular special, and the rest of its multipliers aren't any better. Still, it is one of the fastest ways to get to the bound absolution state, and this time around, note how a buff icon appears underneath Promea's health bar. That is the absolute order buff, and if she has it up while in the bound absolution state, it will upgrade her basic 5 into an enhanced special variant instead. Normally, you use it straight away, directly into the enhanced special, but if you happen to dodge out or interrupt it in some way, then the buff does linger, which technically allows you to get its benefit even off a regular basic attack string. This enhanced variant is called Descending Frost, and it behaves exactly like Promea's basic 5, but with different multipliers. It does more damage, but that doesn't really matter all that much for an anomaly agent. The real benefits come from having more days in anomaly application. It also generates almost 3 times as many decibels as a basic 5, with 93 in a single cast. The drawbacks, however, is that it builds less corrosive chill gauge, and despite it being similar to basic 5 in functionality, doesn't generate any energy for Promeia. There isn't a choice to be had here. If you regular EX special, then it's what you get as a follow-up. And although it isn't as good for corrosive chill generation as a basic 5, it still adds up to more when coupled with the gain from the EX that leads to it. So the enhanced special is good, but there's a second enhanced special upgrade for her basic 5 that's a lot better. If Promeia happens to be hit while casting her regular EX special, or attempts to EX while perfect dodging, she'll automatically transition into a counter EX special, Shrouded in Shadow. This activates Vital View, teleports her behind the enemy, and places her in the bound absolution state. Not to mention that owing to her core passive, it also gives 10 corrosive chill. Like with her regular EX, she also gets the absolute order buff, but it transitions into the far stronger, Layered Frost enhanced special. It does take a bit longer to hit in full, but comes with significantly improved multipliers across the board. Damage, days, anomaly, decibels, and corrosive chill generation. As it's accessed after a counter EX, however, it isn't readily available even if there's energy in stock, as it's dependent on enemy behavior. It's also worth noting that although it is possible to go into the counter EX off a perfect dodge, whether you do so depends on what you need. Since 40 energy is going to be spent either way, doing a regular EX means that you can partially benefit from its hits, meaning more buildup of anomaly and corrosive chill. Doing so, especially if there isn't much time to land its hits, does mean giving up on decibel bonuses from a perfect dodge, however. Despite both the regular and counter EX specials being distinct skills, the counter EX by itself deals no damage and has no multipliers. Unfortunately, it also does not count as a second cast of an EX special if triggered off the regular EX, so Wenjin effects like those from Promea's Signature Wenjin or Fusion Compiler will still only trigger once. All of these specials and EX specials may have slightly different values and functionality, but they all work towards the same outcome, setting up Promeia to use her Abloom EX special, Merciless Judgment. 2 conditions need to be met for its use. A trial by code point must be stocked, and it must follow either her basic 5 or its upgrades, that being Descending Frost or Layered Frost enhanced specials. It isn't used automatically, as it's accessed by holding down the basic or special button after these moves. Tapping will simply initiate the relevant string. After it's used, holding down basic or special, or tapping basic, will shortcut right into a basic 5, allowing for the skill to be looped multiple times if there's enough trial by code points to do so. By itself, it isn't particularly outstanding, with rather mediocre multipliers. It is her only special type attack that generates energy, but builds no corrosive chill gauge. As mentioned before, however, it's through this move that Promea's core passive Ablooms trigger. With how quickly she builds Anomaly, Shadows will make up a fair amount of her damage, but even that pales in comparison to these Ablooms. Not only are they going to outdamage Shadow, owing to having higher multipliers, she can get 6 of them in a stun combo, with the potential for more when Mindscapes are considered, all of which benefits from Abloom damage and Death Shred bonuses. If there's one thing to take away from this, is that Promeia's game plan amounts to setting up resources, team buffs, and enemy statuses to get as many of these Abloom EXs out when it matters most. Do note that its description can be somewhat misleading. The core passive implies that it's when hitting enemies under an anomaly that it consumes a trial by code point to trigger an Abloom, but in reality it consumes the point regardless of their anomaly state. In fact, it can even miss entirely and it will still use it up. Naturally, an Abloom will only occur if there's an anomaly active, so be mindful of it. Okay, that's a lot of different moves, so let's recap real quick. Cold Flash is her regular special, and it won't see any use. Glacial Death is her regular EX special, being a shortcut to Bound Absolution, that being the Cloak Off state, and gives Promeia a buff that lets her upgrade a basic 5. Descending Frost is her first enhanced special, being one such upgrade to her basic 5 that's used after her regular EX. Shrouded in Shadow is her counter EX special, which happens automatically when hit during her regular EX or manually after perfect dodging. It also places her in Bound Absolution and gives her the basic 5 upgrade buff. Layered Frost is her second enhanced special, serving as a better alternate upgrade to her basic 5 that's usable after the counter EX. Then lastly, Merciless Judgment is her Abloom EX, usable only after basic 5 or either of her enhanced specials, consuming a trial by code point on use. While Ablooms from said EX are going to make up most of Promeia's damage output, as mentioned before, she does get Ablooms from her chain attack and ultimate. Hanging Judgment is a chain attack, and it lives up to the name with its animation. It's got good anomaly buildup for the time that it takes, and has especially good decibel values. This is on top of an Abloom which triggers a 100 decibel bonus from Promea's core passive. Unlike her core passive, however, the Abloom multiplier is very low, at 100%, less than a single tick of shock damage, and it doesn't generate much corrosive chill either. Given that she's going to be building a fair bit of anomaly through loop basic 5s or enhanced specials into the Abloom EX, it's often better to let other agents chain attack instead, unless a ridiculous amount of decibels conferred by this skill are needed. As for her ultimate, it's called Glaciating Impalement, and it works in much the same way, but with an Abloom multiplier of 250%. This is still quite low, and it actually generates even less corrosive chill than the chain, but it builds anomaly efficiently enough. When factoring in Promea's abnormally high decibel gains on her skills and the constant boosts that she gets on Abloom triggers, her ultimate sees frequent use. Even on a 5-stun encounter, like against Notorious Butcher with Nangong on the team, Promeia is able to sustain ultimate use on every stun. It also has one additional effect, that being Frost Oath. This is technically a part of Promea's core passive, but it's granted on ultimate use, seen as a buff icon underneath her health bar. It's capped at 1 and can be consumed by pressing special after chain attack, ultimate, or the Abloom EX to link straight into the second enhanced special, Layered Frost. While getting a free use of Promea's second enhanced special is great, it isn't actually required to get to her Abloom EX, as both the chain attack and ultimate will shortcut to basic 5 after cast. Even still, when considering the second enhanced special's high multipliers, especially its corrosive chill and anomaly buildup, it can be an integral part of Promea's combos, helping her fit in more shatters and stun, and get just enough trial by code points to squeeze in an extra Abloom EX. So while neither chain or ultimate are all that exceptional when looked at in isolation, their former's resource generation and the latter's frequency of use do make them useful. That's all for the burst periods though, and setting up to them is just as important. Dodges then make up a key aspect of Promea's out-of-stun gameplay loop. Her dash attack is unremarkable, although it can work as a gap closer. Her dodge counter though is by far and away the most effective way at getting trial by code points, as it generates almost 15 corrosive chill on hit. It will also shortcut right into a basic 5, being about as fast as her hold basic, but bringing with it far more resources. That's on top of decent stats across the board too, with great energy, anomaly buildup, and decibel values. In fact, despite the high multipliers on her second enhanced special, it can be better to not use the counter EX to get to it, and simply fall back on dodge countering instead. Said special, Layered Frost, generates a little over 9 corrosive chill, with an extra 10 from Shrouded and Shadow, the counter EX. A dodge counter into a basic 5, however, is going to add up to 20 corrosive chill, with no resource spent. It's also not possible to assist counter into the second enhanced special, as its input window is far too delayed. So doing a standard assist counter is better in almost every way. More corrosive chill, daze, decibels from multiple agents, and energy. I say almost because you still want specials to trigger effects, like those from Promea's core passive and additional ability. It does also build a fair bit more anomaly. So while it's worth using early on out of stun to set things up, prioritizing dodge counters will likely be the better approach, be it with basic 5 for corrosive chill or assist counters for daze and decibels. Talking about assists, Promea's aren't all that bad either. Her quick assist is okay, it shortcuts into basic 3 but isn't all that fast and doesn't have any noteworthy multipliers. Her assist follow-up though is amazing. It generates a decent 7 corrosive chill and has oddly high stats, to the point it's setting records, packing the highest decibel build out of all agents in the game, and it's not even close. For context, most agents sit somewhere between 80 and 100 decibels on an assist follow-up, but many don't even get that much. Promeia gets just under 232 decibels with her assist follow-up. When factoring in defensive assist bonuses, she gets more than 450 decibels on a single parry. Corrin was the previous record holder, at around 166 on an assist follow-up, and that's with her obscenely long animation. Premier's is not only reasonably fast, it also shortcuts into her basic 5, which yields even more resources. Yet despite how good it is as a skill, it's unlikely to see much use. You're still going to be getting more decibels on other characters by parrying on them instead of Promeia. Admittedly, since decibel gain is partially shared with the team, some characters would get more decibels by doing assist counters into Promeia over parrying themselves. She's that good a battery. But with how many decibels Promeia gets generally, prioritizing dodge counters, and in particular assist counters, is likely going to be the better approach to balance decibels with corrosive chill and daze. Not to mention many of her team options like Lycan or Vivian have their own mechanics be tied to assist follow-ups, further increasing the value of spending assist points on them instead. So for once, we have a skill that is really good, but won't see too much use. Do keep all this in mind though, as if you find yourself having misaligned ultimates or needing to build to it quickly, Premier's assist follow-up might be the solution. With that, we've gone through all of her skills. In terms of investment priority, I'd recommend her core first, then basic and special, followed by ultimate, dodge, and assist. Core is by far and away the most important. Nodes A, C, and E boost anomaly mastery, translating directly into damage owing to the core passive's conversion mechanic, and it's what determines the scaling on her EX special Ablooms. As most anomaly agents do their damage through anomalies rather than raw damage, and anomaly buildup doesn't increase with levels, a lot of the value from investing in skills comes from the increase in days multipliers, and Promeia is no different. So basic attack and special are good to level for that reason. Standard teams are likely to benefit most from basic, as specials will be reserved for combos, whereas double anomaly teams get a fair amount of special casts in the out of stun period. Following that, ultimate for damage, then dodge for days, and assist last, as until Promeia finds herself in a supportive role like Jane, she's unlikely to get many uses of it in a fight. Before moving on from her kit, there is one aspect of Promeia's skills that's not covered by multipliers or stat values, that being finisher properties. As a quick intro, a finisher is a tag assigned to a hit that allows for it to initiate stun, kill an enemy, and, most importantly, trigger anomalies. Being aware of where in an attack its finisher points are, and in some cases, whether or not an attack even has that property to begin with, is important for tailoring how to play a character and optimize their combos. Promeia's Basic 4, for example, has a very early finisher, triggering anomalies at the very start of its cast. On the surface, this is good, as it avoids overcapping on anomaly buildup. Problem is, this finisher property is only on its startup hits. If the enemy isn't already at or very near the cap, the majority of its buildup is wasted. A regular EX special doesn't even have a finisher. No matter how many times you use it, it cannot trigger anomalies, only build up the gauge. This is especially problematic for characters that listen to such tags. Vivian's Ablooms are meant to trigger on EX special use, but Promeia can only trigger them with her Merciless Judgment EX, her own Abloom skill, as that's the only EX special in her entire kit that has a finisher property. Finishers are not only triggering anomalies, they are also triggering shatter. Promeia's ultimate has two distinct finisher points, one on her dive kick and another on its final strike. If an enemy gets frozen by the first finisher, the second one will immediately break them out, whereas if they're frozen by the second finisher, that leads to longer freeze durations. Shatter will only take once freeze expires or the next finisher hits, usually from another character's chain attack. In fact, managing freeze durations is important not only for combos, but for routing too. Getting 5 stuns on Notorious Butcher is incredibly difficult if stun durations keep getting extended by freeze. Promeia's second enhanced special then is especially useful to deal with this, as almost all of its hits are finishes, so it can be used to both trigger freeze and break enemies out straight away. Anomaly and the Zordra ICDs can be tricky to deal with as is, so have these finisher points at the back of your mind when tailoring combos and rotations. Vengeance also have effects that need to be managed, although thankfully this is quite easy for Promeia's signature, Frostfall Sickle. True to her status as a Krampus judge, its crescent moons look almost like eyeballs, observing every move as they shift in place. Not only does it look good, it is good. It packs an Anomaly Mastery main stat, which is very important to get the most out of Promeia's core passive conversion mechanic, and it provides up to 40% ice damage and 35% Abloom damage, which are pretty steep bonuses. It only requires the use of specials or EX specials, and given its buffs last 40 seconds, with stack duration being refreshed in full, Promeia's own passives will be falling off long before this Vengeance buffs do. Despite it being a strong weapon though, it's far from needed, as Fusion Compiler is a surprisingly good alternative. I say surprising because, well, it's a 10% main stat Vengeance. This has counter synergy with Promeia, since the Abloom Death Shred that she gets from her additional ability won't scale well. As a quick breakdown as to why, 40% Death Shred plus 24% pen ratio doesn't reduce the enemy death by 64%. If an enemy has 1000 death and Promeia has 40% Death Shred, their death would go down to 600. The 24% from Fusion Compiler's pen ratio acts on that value, not the initial death, taking it down to 456. That's a reduction of 54.4% instead. At first glance, this would make it a suboptimal pick, but there's more to Fusion Compiler than its main stat. Promeia has no attack percent bonuses as part of her kit, so the unconditional 12% combat attack that it grants is strong, on top of the 25 anomaly proficiency that it gives on every special or EX cast. Most agents can't use this effectively, as despite stacking up to 3 times, it lasts only 8 seconds and has each stack's duration tick separately. Promeia though has no issue with this. Her regular EX builds 1 stack, her enhanced special builds the second, and her Abloom EX builds the third, so it's entirely possible to maintain full stacks for most of her burst. It isn't ideal, as you're likely to go into a burst window without full stacks, which matters given the way Abloom snapshotting works, and it does demand better energy management on Promeia, but it's workable. After all, the Death Shred bonus on additional is for Ablooms only. All the Shatters, Disorders, and Vortex triggers are getting the full value of the pen ratio. At phase 1, it isn't all that strong to be honest. Angel in the Shell is a better alternative, providing 30% Anomaly Mastery and an unconditional 90 Anomaly Proficiency on top. With dupes, however, Fusion Compiler is going to exceed its performance. P3 should already be good enough, but at P5 it's no contest, with 24% attack and up to 150 Anomaly Proficiency. The gap between Promeia's signature and a P5 Fusion Compiler is pretty small. Frostfall Sickle is going to be better, and the lack of Anomaly Mastery can be frustrating to work with at times, with build-up sometimes being just short of what's needed for a combo. But it is possible to route around it, and I'd average around 1,500 points in score difference. Naturally, a P5 Fusion Compiler isn't cheap, and few people are going to have it, but even at P1 it was still beating out the A rank alternatives like Electro Lip Gloss and Weeping Gemini, where an 8,000 plus score difference was the standard. This is with Nangong though, and I didn't try the various vengeance on Vivian teams, where I could see Weeping Gemini coming out ahead of a P1 Fusion compiler as there's fewer stuns to reset its bonus. So if you can afford it and don't have an overclocked Fusion compiler, Promea's signature will unquestionably be the best pick. If you do, however, it's more than fine to use Grace's signature, with minimal performance differences at high phases. And if you've got neither the funds nor the dupes, running with it at P1 or making do with Weeping Gemini is good enough. Aria's signature, if available, can also work as a functional stat stick. As for Promea's actual stats, D4 and D6 are straightforward. Anomaly Proficiency on D4 and Anomaly Mastery on D6. We want to get the most out of the core passive conversion mechanic after all. D5 can really be anything. In a completely isolated scenario, even with the gains from Frostfall Sickle, Ice damage is likely to be the best pick. But that's if you've got a flat attack buff from the team, like Yuzuha. Even with her, a slight damage bonus buff would tip the scales over to attack percent, and in the upcoming Deadly Assault rotations, I scored highest with it. Pen ratio though is the go-to pick for those using Fusion Compiler, as unlike other stats that get saturated, the more you stack, the better it gets. You do want to avoid pen ratio on all other vengeance, but between damage percent and attack percent, variance among them is so marginal that even a single substats worth could be the difference, so whichever D5 you have with the best rows is the one to use. As for substats, Anomaly Proficiency and attack percent are the priority. Since Promeia is generally attack starved and has fixed Abloom Scaling, substat distribution can be a little more flexible, but Anomaly Proficiency will still pull out ahead. In game tests, we're using a 0.6% difference, so an attack percent sub is about 2/3 of an Anomaly Proficiency one. The old adage of prioritizing a higher sub count over subset distribution still holds strong. Post-production lin-o here, actually it'd be closer to a 0.4% difference as I failed to ensure the AP bonus from her drive disk set was active, so AP is still better, but not by much. Talking about drive disks, the 4-piece pick is Notes from the Chained, being the tailor-made set for Promeia. She's constantly triggering Ablooms and freezes, so it's always up, and getting both Anomaly and Disorder damage bonuses is an especially strong and undiluted multiplier to benefit from. This does have some gameplay implications though. Freeze is easy enough. Promeia's buildup is ridiculously high as is, but not every team will have Ablooms be used early. On a double Anomaly team, Promeia can use her Abloom EX near the start to get the buff active, but when running with stunners, it can often be best to reserve trial by code points for the stun. The result is that the first Abloom in a combo is likely to be weaker than the rest owing to the lower Anomaly Proficiency, so try to route around triggering freeze with the first Abloom EX so as to not waste casts on a weak Anomaly. 2Ps is Faith's Melody, with the Anomaly Mastery that it gives directly translating to damage owing to the core passive conversion mechanic. If, however, you happen to use Fusion Compiler, then Puffer Electro could pull out ahead, assuming that you run a pen ratio D5 and aren't losing out on shadows from the lower buildup. When it comes to teammates, Promeia has a few standout picks. Yuzuha is the indisputable best support. She's long established as the go-to pick for Anomaly teams with strong buffs and undiluted buildup. While historically she might have been used to help balance out anomalies for disorders, I actually had the most success element matching Promeia and going all out on shadows, be it in stunner or dual anomaly teams. Although that too did have some issues, as freeze would build up so ridiculously fast that on some enemies, there weren't any opportunities to dodge counter or defensive assist from the constant interrupts, lowering resource build. Barring that, Astra is always a decent universal pick, and Nicole can work as a free-to-play alternative, scaling especially well owing to her Death Shred playing up Promeia's own. Zhao is also a supportive option, especially if making use of assist counters with a Bunny and Wonderland set, but only in double anomaly teams, so as to maintain Promeia's additional ability. If Nangong is on the team, then Suna does just fine as well, with the two idols going all in on high stun burst. On the topic, Nangong is a ridiculously broken unit, and one with especially good synergies. Her Polarity Disorders and Ablooms trigger the Corrosive Chill boost from Promeia's core passive, which when paired with her stun duration increase, yields more Abloom EXs and combos. It goes both ways too, as Promeia's frequent EX special use makes her easy maintenance of a 4-piece Faith's Melody, increasing the team's overall damage. Promeia may be an anomaly agent, but she is very well suited to a stun-oriented playstyle due to having readily accessible Ablooms, so being able to conserve her resources and have most of her bursts benefit from the stun damage % multiplier bonuses goes a long way. She doesn't need to though, and Vivian also works incredibly well, having arguably even better synergy. Team-wide Abloom damage and Death Shred significantly increase Vivian's own damage contribution, while the back-to-back Abloom triggers makes for some pretty ridiculous Corrosive Chill generation. As a Faith's Melody user, Vivian also gets great uptime of it. Nangong did perform better, but not by much. Scorching Frost, the buff I used, made Ice far stronger than Ether, so it was difficult to balance out anomalies in such a way Ablooms always triggered on Ice. Yet even with my subpar routing, Vivian runs were around 3,000 score behind, oftentimes less. On runs where I wasn't able to 5-stun Butcher or got only a few seconds in, Vivian would actually score higher. Considering how dominant Nangong has been for Anomaly, the fact that Vivian can partially keep up is a testament to how well the team works. Other characters can do fine too, but Yuzuha, Nangong and Vivian are head and shoulders above, so be aware that without them, there will be a large performance gap. Bernice is an anomaly partner alternative, and she's okay. With most anomaly bosses being fire resistant or at least neutral, there aren't many fights to run her in, but she's a relatively hands-off character and the occasional Ember Flow Abloom is a nice to have. Her build-up is nowhere near Promea's level, so Yuzuha felt like an important teammate, but there's nothing stopping you from running a Promeia Bernice ladder team. Honestly, even without Yuzuha, a dedicated support like Astra is likely to give better scores. After all, King of the Summit and Blazing Laurel aren't doing anything for the team when compared to Moonlight Lullaby or Astral Voice, and either support signatures or just kaboom the cannon. So I wouldn't recommend it for scoring. But given how long overdue we've been a proper Bernice ladder team, just let Burning Desires play in the background and have some fun. Lycan, on the other hand, is a competent stunner. The stun damage multiplier from his additional works in anomaly teams, and when coupled with both a 25% rest rate and some obscenely high days application, he can hold his own. It's to the point where you're not going to have the time to max out Premier's resources for every stun. In fact, he's likely to perform at a similar level as most other dual anomaly teams, so while he's certainly far behind either Nangong or Vivian, it's a workable low-cost alternative that can still do fine. Do note that while I'm showing him on Butcher, you won't want to run him here, as the team has no disorders. Against the 2.8 boss, however, he can at least pull his own weight. Yanagi is a good option in theory, with her Polarity Disorder helping build Corrosive Chill, but in practice the comp felt awkward to play. Ice disorders aren't very strong, so Yanagi's EX was only ever worth using on Shock, making it tricky to route fights. Both Promeia and Yanagi demand field time, and I'd get more value out of doing dodge counters into basic 5s and looping shatters than sitting on Yanagi to sustain her energy needs. This would further highlight the disparity in their build-up, where even with the 3-second extension to Ice Anomaly, I'd sometimes drop it as Yanagi struggled to keep up. Similar problems arise when running her with Miyabi. She isn't giving Polarity Disorders, but Frost counts as freeze, which means every anomaly trigger was generating 10 Corrosive Chill. This means that element matching with Yuzuha and occasionally on-fielding Miyabi for anomaly build-up didn't feel as bad. Unfortunately, balancing field time was still difficult, with Miyabi struggling to keep up in energy and Decibels frequently misaligning, leading to awkward stun rotations. So while they can run together, I'd advise against it, as both agents are far better served by other, more accessible options, like Lycan. Alice is no good either, needing to on-field so as to build her blade etiquette and being unwieldy due to disorder ICDs from her Polarity Assaults. As for Arya, she's weird. Technically she's an Abloom-based damage dealer, so Premier's bonuses are actually very strong for her. It's almost like having a permanent Nicole. Since Arya can Abloom frequently, that does fuel Premier with a lot of Corrosive Chill, so they kind of play up each other in that regard. But with how greedy Arya is for field time when enemies are stunned, there isn't really much of an opportunity to get both of their damage off. You either Abloom with one or the other, so both agents are far better served by other units. Grace can work, I suppose. I gave her very little time, and like with Yanagi, simply looping shadows felt like a better option than trying to push her shock anomalies. On the plus side, she's far faster to cycle with, owing to the fact that her build-up is unlocked behind long basic strings, she's got Ablooms via pulse, and Premier can work as a battery for Grace with her high decibel generation, which can partially offset the resource disparity from not on-fielding her as much. As with the others before though, there's far better teams for either of them. Neither Jane nor Piper offer or gain much from Premier, so they fit the anomaly bill but nothing I'd recommend. Trigger can be a functional stunner option, but when I say trigger, I mean Spectral Gaze. So if you happen to have a P5 trigger signature lying around, who am I to stop you? In short, a Premier Nangong Yuzuha team will be best, with Vivian being a close second to Nangong as a surprisingly competitive runner-up. Everything else will do significantly worse, but there are workable options, and if you don't really care for performance, there's always the for fun teams. When it comes to Mindscapes, Promeia has remarkably decent ones for a damage dealer. Her M1 is really strong, being about on par with recent support and stun rem ones in terms of team score value add, which is really saying something. It's quite straightforward. Get a free trial by code point after using her ultimate and increase the Abloom dash threat from her additional ability by 20%, bringing it to 60% total. Keeping in mind that death threat gets better the more you have of it, this has an outsized impact on her damage as a whole. If run with a stunner, this helps her deal with Corrosive Chill build issues, as it's very difficult to be topped up in resources for every stun, especially in 5-stun fights or those with long phase transitions. And if run with Vivian, well, the dash threat applies to her too. Between Premier's signature Wenjin and her M1, I'd say her M1 has the edge, even with the dash threat bonus furthering the anti-synergy with Fusion Compiler. This may change with a Wind Anomaly agent, as Anomaly Mastery could lead to more Vortex triggers, but as it stands, it's a highly competitive Mindscape for a damage dealer. As for her M2, it's pretty decent, with a flat 40 Anomaly proficiency gain and a 20% increase to the multiplier of her EX Ablooms. With anywhere from a third to half of her damage coming from it, this is a sizable value add. Depending on the team, this alone could be a 10% increase to scores. M3 and M5 do very little for her, unlike Attacker and Rupture agents, as the increase of their multipliers does not translate to anomaly damage, so they're stepping stone Mindscapes. M4 can be quite good. It's an extra 5 Corrosive Chill whenever Promeia triggers an Abloom, with a 0.5 second cooldown. This is a big help in making her more self-sufficient. When factoring in the extra Abloom EX every ultimate from her M1, it adds up. On a stunner team like with Nangong, you're looking at 140 to 150 Corrosive Chill in a 3-minute fight, And if with Vivian, then that'd be far higher, as Promeia gets to Abloom EX far more often in that comp. So by itself it adds nothing, but when routed around can be especially potent. M6 is great from a numerical standpoint, but does promote more aggressive dual anomaly teams. It's an unconditional 15% rash threat to Promeia's anomaly and disorder damage, which in turn translates to Ablooms if triggered off her anomalies. It then has an extra effect of a free Abloom trigger every 15 seconds. This has a middling multiplier of 200%, but it does give an extra 5 corrosive chill and 100 decibels. In standard teams, this won't see much benefit, as resources tend to be reserved for the instant burst, and Promeia already has enough decibels to sustain 4 to 5 ultimates in a 3-minute fight. In double anomaly teams, however, this can be triggered on cooldown, making for a potential 60 corrosive chill, 1200 decibels, and 2400% in Abloom multipliers. So most of its benefit is in the rest shred, but it can be even better in certain comps. With all this in mind, let's go through some combos, starting with Vivian. You want to go in with around 80 to 100 energy, depending on if ultimate will be ready, 2 trial by code points stocked, and as much of the corrosive chill gauge built as possible. On a standard 12-second duration enemy, and with Vivian's Abloom generating plenty of gauge for Promeia, you can get away with not needing to be topped up in corrosive chill. The more guard feathers Vivian has, the better, so using ultimate before the stun begins is good, which is likely to inflict corruption on the enemy. As stun is about to begin, use Premier's regular EX special to start with, then go into the enhanced special follow-up, and lastly, hold basic for her Abloom EX. Ideally, this would trigger freeze for a disorder, as Promeia is likely to be better built than Vivian for damage, but if not, loop it again until it happens. Once the anomaly is up, make it so that the next basic 5 or Abloom EX triggers a chain, which goes to Vivian so she can top up in feathers. After which, immediately swap to Promeia and do another EX ring, letting the first Abloom EX trigger a chain, which goes to Vivian. Her dive is short enough that it lands right before the chain prompt, which disorders freeze of corruption and converts all of her feathers. After the second chain, ultimate if available, but doing an EX ring works too. When coupled with the build-up from the EXs, it's enough to trigger freeze, after which keep looping basic 5s into Abloom EXs. After the second set, it's worth making use of the Frost Oath point for the second enhanced special, as its high build-up rate can lead to another freeze just before stun ends. This gives more corrosive chill, hopefully enough for one more trial by code point, which when used on the Abloom EX will trigger Shatter, as well as another corruption and disorder from Vivian's own Abloom trigger. It's pretty straightforward. Just get as many Ablooms as possible, ideally on Ice Anomaly, while maximizing the number of Shatters and disorders. The same concept applies to Nangong combos, but if you're pushing for 5 stuns, minimizing the amount of time an enemy is frozen for is pretty important. Every second an enemy spends stunned is a second they aren't getting stunned. As with Vivian, it's best if the enemy starts with corruption ticking, and it has a similar start with a full EX ring. Instead of triggering chain on the Abloom EX though, do so with a basic 5 follow-up. We'll go through why in a bit. Nangong's chain attack builds a ridiculous amount of anomaly, which then triggers corruption and a disorder, after which, cancel and swap to Promeia, going into an immediate ultimate. Depending on the enemy's ether anomaly prior to stun, the chain attack alone won't be enough to trigger corruption. In such cases, you can use a held basic attack or an EX special, then basic attack on Promeia while waiting for the anomaly to trigger. As the ultimate hits, notice how the enemy freezes on the first finisher, only to be broken out by the second as the chain attack triggers. The Abloom EX and basic 5 that triggered Nangong's chain attack built enough anomaly to allow the ultimate to freeze early, keeping the total stun time short. From there, it's another Nangong chain. Since this alone only builds about half the gauge, EX special, then swap back to Promeia for basic attacks. Do basics 1 through to 3, then a full EX ring. Note how despite the enhanced special doing enough build-up to trigger freeze, it's not until the Abloom EX that it's applied. This is because of the Disorder ICD, which forces us to wait 3 seconds before applying another anomaly, so the basic attacks help with build-up and delay things long enough. You don't need to do a regular EX special here, and simply going into a basic 5 naturally would do the job, but that's a fair bit slower than EXing during a basic 3. If using Fusion Compiler, it's also required to keep up buff stacks and build up more anomaly, which would normally be lacking due to it not having anomaly mastery bonuses. Since the Abloom EX triggers freeze, using the Frost Oath point for the second enhanced special breaks it quickly, after which there's room to fit 2 more Ablooms and get another freeze on top, giving even more damage through Shatter. On freezable enemies, this affords enough time and resources to get a third Abloom EX, but you might want to pocket a trial by code point depending on the routing, as if pushing for 5 stuns, Promeia has very little time to build corrosive chill. Keeping hold of it to have subsequent combos flow smoothly tends to be the better option. That's only 4, maybe 5 Ablooms though. With proper freeze management, it's possible to get 6, even 7 with M1. It's almost the same, but instead of wasting time on basic 5 for anomaly buildup, go straight into Nangong's chain after the Abloom EX. EX special into Premier's ultimate, but this time when it hits, it will only freeze on the final strike, ensuring that stun is spores for all of Nangong's second chain attack. Rather than doing basic attacks to wait for the Disorder ICD and build up Ice Anomaly, go straight into a full EX ring and start looping Ablooms on basic 5s. This does mean getting an Abloom on Ether rather than Ice, in this case a 1 million damage difference, but the gain from getting more Ablooms in a stun more than makes up for it. In the footage, I spend the Frost Oath point for a second enhanced special to break the freeze, as there's no need to extend the stun further for only 6 Ablooms, but if pushing for 7, like with M1, save it for after so as to retain the freeze state for longer. A full EX string can be done at any point in this final stretch, but isn't required. It can be helpful to generate a bit more corrosive chill, but a basic 5 would normally suffice. Whereas the 4 Abloom combo had me end the first turn at around 14,000, the 6 Abloom one was going to just about 19,000 instead, give or take 500 score. Problem is, this would offset subsequent combos, as I'd be lacking in trial by cold points as time went on, and the additional time the boss spent frozen made it much harder to hit 5 stuns. On a 4 or 3 stun rotation though, going for more Ablooms is going to be better. Working around Promeia's resource economy is key to performing well with her. It's worth calling to attention that anomaly agents like Promeia are influenced by multiple factors. Does she have the anomaly mastery from her signature wenching? Is Yuzuha on the team to buff anomaly build-up rate? And is she using her own signature to max out traditional Bloody's buff? Does the enemy have a double, or single, or no weakness match? And are there any build-up bonuses from endgame stage buffs? Does Promeia have to work around another anomaly agent's mechanic, like Vivian's Feather Generation and Spend, or Bernice's Ember Flow? While all these change what happens in a combo, there are universal concepts to work around. Go in with as many resources as possible so as to fit enough Abloom EXs and shatters in a stun window. Try to get as many Ablooms to trigger on the anomaly built by the agent with the best stats, most likely Promeia's Ice Anomaly. In which case, make use of basic attacks and the second enhanced special from Frost Oath to build Ice Anomaly to better enable this. Work around the Zorder ICD and freeze durations to maximize damage, being mindful of finisher points for this. And lastly, accept that in many cases, like with Vivian or in 6 or 7 Abloom combos, natural build-up rates and ICDs make it impossible to get every Abloom on a single element. Keep in mind that even the individual encounter team combination matters. Minimizing time and stun is a big deal for Nangong or Notorious Butcher, but this isn't necessarily the best approach for Vivian, where stun counts are much lower. Tailor the combo to both the fight and the team. Let's quickly recap over all that we've learned so far and go through Promeia's game plan. At the start of a fight, it's good to use an EX special early. This activates traditional abilities Ice Anomaly build-up rate buff and applies Presumption of Guilt on enemy targets, being the 40% Abloom Death Shred effect. It's also needed for Promeia's signature Wenjin, activating both its standard and Abloom damage bonuses. On stunner teams, enemies will be getting stunned within 30 seconds, so there shouldn't be much of a need to reapply it until then, but on double anomaly teams, use it and an Abloom EX early to activate the anomaly proficiency increase from Nose from the Chain's full piece effect. Always reserve some energy for the stun period, as it's an accessible way to get to her Abloom EX. For some teams, like Vivian, Promeia will need enough to do 2, possibly 3 regular EX specials, so resource management here is important. Remember that her ultimate provides a Frost Oath stack, which shows a free use of her second enhanced special with no counter needed. Be mindful of its constant finishes, which can either be a blessing or a curse, depending on if you need to break enemies out of freeze quickly for faster stun turnarounds, or keep them in case for longer to get higher combo damage. When out of stun, prioritize getting dodge counters on Promeia, as their high corrosive chill generation and shortcut to basic 5 make them the most efficient way to build resources. Broadly speaking, the flowchart is, if you need more corrosive chill, dodge counter into basic 5. If you need more days and decibels, assist counter out of Promeia into another agent. And if you want a balance of both, then counter EX. Naturally, certain lineups change the prioritization, with 5 stun routes of Vivian teams almost always prioritizing assist counters. Given Premier's obscenely high decibel build, it's usually better to feed parries to other characters, but on routes where she's short of an ultimate, then it's worth working some of her assist follow-ups in. With how much it builds, using Promeia as a team decibel battery may actually be better than parrying on another agent. And lastly, do your best to align her resources with burst periods, be it getting as many Abloom EXs and the Zorders and stun, or making effective use of Promeia and other agents as Ablooms to keep up a constant barrage of damage. If you can manage all this, then she's capable of pulling some impressive numbers. All in all, Promeia is a great entry into the anomaly archetype. She can be run for instant burst or in traditional dual damage comps. She benefits from Disorder but can deliver much of her damage with back-to-back anomaly triggers. And she's got accessible builds for free or low spenders while also having decent vertical investment options. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. With so many recent bosses being made with the sole purpose of anti-shielding Miyabi, Promeia gets a short end of the stick by virtue of collective punishment. At the same time, the versatility in how she can be played and the ways in which she's likely to synergize with Wind, Vortex, and any future Abloom units does give her a lot of potential, which isn't something that can be said of our beloved Void Hunter. I should point out that endgame balancing doesn't help paint a flattering picture. Recent bosses have been made with such obscenely high HP that scores tend to look low in comparison. A 224 million HP Notorious Butcher isn't doing anyone any favors. But that doesn't take away from Premier's strong numbers, which are competitive even in the current meta. Both the Nangong and Vivian runs here had multiple points of improvement, with potential for a good 1.5 to 2,000 increase in score. That's with only 28 substats too, so more mature builds are certain to pull off even higher numbers. She may be somewhat niche, but she does perform, and as we come to learn more about units in version 3 and beyond, it may have her value increase still. If you're interested in keeping up with said units, want to learn more about tech and fundamental game mechanics, or happen to be interested in detailed character guides, why not like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell? I've got more videos coming. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.